6 months after my son asked to stay in my house for just a little while. His wife set down her coffee and told me it was time for me to move out of my own bedroom. The kids need more space. Melissa said, "Maybe you should use the downstairs room from now on." My son Ethan didn't look embarrassed. He nodded as if the three of us were discussing a perfectly reasonable furniture arrangement, instead of my place in the house I'd bought after my divorce. I looked at the unpaid utility bill beside his plate. Then at the blue paint samples Melissa had lined up on my counter. "I'll think about what needs to change," I said. They mistook that for surrender. By the following week, I was turning away the contractor Melissa had hired to remodel my bedroom. 2 months later, a moving truck finally pulled into my driveway, but it wasn't there for my furniture. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 52 then, and I ran a small electrical business outside Columbus, Ohio. Small meant me. One apprentice named Luis, 2 service vans, and a woman named Joyce who handled the phone 3 mornings a week and somehow kept the entire operation from drifting into chaos. I bought the house 8 years earlier, after my marriage ended. It wasn't the family home Ethan had grown up in. That house had been sold during the divorce, and my ex-wife, Linda, and I divided what remained after the mortgage. I used my share as a down payment on a worn brick house with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a den on the first floor. The place needed work. The panel belonged in a museum. Half the outlets weren't grounded, and the kitchen lights flickered whenever the refrigerator started. I repaired it slowly, mostly on Sundays. By the time Ethan was grown, it had stopped feeling like the place I landed after losing my marriage. It felt like mine. Ethan was 29 and worked as a route supervisor for a beverage distributor. Melissa was 28 and worked part-time at a dental office. Their children, Noah and Sophie, were 7 and 4. I loved those kids with the helpless kind of love that can make a sensible man agree to things before he has considered the cost. When Ethan called that February, he said the owner of their rental townhouse was raising the rent and wouldn't renew month to month. They wanted to save enough for a deposit somewhere better, instead of rushing into another bad lease. 3 months, he said. Maybe less. We'll buy groceries and help with utilities. I said yes that evening. The first few weeks were almost enjoyable. Noah waited for my van after school and asked questions about every tool I carried. Sophie left plastic animals in my work boots. Melissa cooked twice a week, and Ethan fixed a sagging gate I had ignored for a year. Then temporary life settled into a permanent rhythm. Melissa's cooking became takeout charged to Ethan's card. The gate started sagging again. My electric bill rose. The grocery shelves emptied faster, and the promised help with utilities never appeared. Whenever I brought up their search, Ethan had an answer. Inventory week was too busy. One apartment required a larger deposit. Another was in the wrong school district. Melissa wanted to wait until her hours increased. At 3 months, he asked for 1 more month. At 4, he said summer listings would be better. At 5, I stopped asking every week because Noah had begun listening from the hallway whenever housing came up. That was my mistake. I thought silence was kindness. Ethan heard permission. The morning Melissa claimed my bedroom, the children were at a summer day camp. She had spread paint cards across the kitchen island. Pale blue for Noah, Leander for Sophie. A warm gray, she said, would make the master bedroom feel larger. "Which room is warm gray?" I asked. She glanced at Ethan. "Yours. Ours. If we rearrange." Then came the line about the downstairs room. The den had a sofa bed but no closet. It held my filing cabinet, a drafting table, estimates, tax folders, and the old stereo I played while doing paperwork. There was a half bathroom across the hall, but the only shower was upstairs. "You mean permanently?" I asked. Melissa folded her hands. "At least while we're all here. You're up early anyway, and it would keep us from waking you." "Dad, the kids can't share forever," Ethan said. "You know how Noah gets when Sophie wakes up. You've been looking for a place with 3 bedrooms. He leaned back. "Those are expensive. This just makes sense for now." I remember studying his face and looking for some sign that he understood what he was asking. There wasn't one. He looked tired, slightly irritated, and certain I would eventually agree because I usually did. I gave them my calm answer and left for work. In the van, my hands shook badly enough that I dropped the key twice before getting it into the ignition. It wasn't really about a bedroom. It was the casual certainty in Melissa's voice, and the way Ethan used his children as if loving them required me to disappear one room at a time. I spent the morning replacing damaged outlets in a bakery. It was ordinary work, which helped. Wires don't care who feels betrayed. Either the connection is secure or it isn't. When I got home, my neighbor, Barbara Klein, was trimming dead flowers along her driveway. She waved me over. "Daniel, are you really moving?" she asked. "Moving where?" Her pruning shears stopped in midair. "Melissa said Ethan would be taking over the house soon. I thought you were buying a condo." I must have looked confused, because she immediately softened her voice. Maybe I misunderstood. She said they were rearranging before the transfer. We were talking about paint. That's all. I told Barbara she had done nothing wrong and went inside. Melissa was upstairs with the children. Ethan was still at work. The paint cards were gone, but a yellow measuring tape lay across the kitchen counter beside a page of room dimensions. At the top, in Melissa's handwriting, were the words, "Dad's suite downstairs." I stood there for a long time. A suite, not a temporary sleeping arrangement. They had renamed my office, my bedroom, and my future, without asking me a single question. That night, after the children were asleep, I asked Ethan and Melissa to sit down. "Did either of you tell Barbara this house was being transferred to Ethan?" Melissa's eyes moved to my son. Ethan rubbed his jaw. It came up casually. She said, "We weren't announcing anything. There is nothing to announce." Ethan exhaled. "Dad, you've talked about downsizing." I said I might want less yard someday. "I never said I was giving you this house." "Nobody said giving. There are ways to work it out." That phrase bothered me more than an outright demand. "What ways?" He glanced at Melissa again. "We haven't gotten that far." "You've gotten far enough to assign me a room." Melissa's cheeks reddened. "I thought Ethan had already discussed the general plan with you." "What general plan?" Ethan cut in. "This is getting blown out of proportion." I looked at him. "Did you tell your wife I agreed to transfer my house to you?" He didn't answer directly. He said he had assumed the house would eventually stay in the family. Melissa stared at him as though the floor had shifted under her chair. "You said your dad offered it once he was ready," she said. "I said he'd mentioned downsizing." "That isn't what you said." There it was. The first crack in their united plan. Melissa had behaved with outrageous entitlement. But Ethan had built part of that entitlement with a lie. I didn't enjoy seeing them turn on each other. I felt tired. "No one is moving into my bedroom." I said, "No rooms are being painted. Tomorrow evening. We're going to discuss when you're leaving." Ethan stood. "So that's it. You're choosing a room over your grandchildren." "No. I'm choosing whether I still make decisions in my own home." The next afternoon, a white pickup stopped in front of the house, just as I was returning from a service call. A man in a polo shirt came to the door carrying a laser measure and a folder. Melissa had asked him for an estimate to add a closet to the den, close off one doorway, and convert part of the laundry area into a shower. He seemed embarrassed when I told him I owned the house and had authorized none of it. He apologized, gave me his card, and left. No contract had been signed, and no money had changed hands. That was fortunate for everyone. I found Melissa in the kitchen. "You called a contractor. It was only an estimate. Cancel every plan you made for this house." She crossed her arms. "I was trying to make this workable. You were making it permanent." That evening, I laid one page on the table. I had spoken with a local attorney I knew through a remodeling company. She told me not to change locks, remove belongings, or shut off services, family or not. I needed to handle the move properly. She helped me prepare written notice that gave Ethan and Melissa 60 days to leave. More time than the minimum, she said, applied to our situation. The page also said there would be no alterations to the house until they moved. They would contribute $700 a month toward groceries and utilities. It was far below market rent, but it ended the idea that staying cost them nothing. Ethan read it twice. "You talked to a lawyer." I asked how to do this correctly. Melissa pushed the paper away. "You're evicting your grandchildren. I'm giving 2 employed adults 60 days to rent a home. You know we can't afford what landlords want." Ethan said. Then show me the plan you made during the 6 rent-free months. He looked down. There was no plan. They had saved a little over $3,000. Not the amount I had imagined. Some had gone toward old credit card balances, which was responsible. Some had gone toward a newer SUV, after Melissa's car began having transmission trouble. The monthly payment erased much of what they should have been saving. I didn't lecture them about the vehicle. They were adults, and it was already parked in my driveway. I simply said their financial choices could not become a permanent claim on my house. The next 2 weeks were miserable. Ethan barely spoke to me. Melissa stopped eating dinner in the kitchen if I was there. They paid the first $700 on the last possible day and made sure I heard what they could no longer buy because of it. The children knew something was wrong. Noah asked whether I was mad at him for needing a room. I sat beside him on the back steps and told him no child was to blame for an adult housing problem. I said he would always have a place to visit me. But his parents were going to find a home of their own. Can I still keep my dinosaur here? He asked. As long as you want. That conversation nearly broke my resolve. I went into the garage afterward, sat on an overturned bucket, and wondered whether peace was worth making my son feel rejected. Then I remembered the page labeled Dad's Suite, and Barbara asking when I was moving. Peace, bought by surrendering. Ownership of my life wasn't peace. Ethan called his mother. By the next morning, Linda was on the phone asking why I had suddenly thrown the family out. I told her they were still in the house and had 52 days left. Then I explained the bedroom, the contractor, and the transfer story. Linda went quiet. He told me you asked them to stay longer because you hated living alone. She said. That was the deeper lie. Ethan had told me they were trapped by the rental market. He had told Melissa I intended to give him the house. He had told his mother I needed them there. Each version made him look less like a man taking advantage and more like a son doing what the family wanted. Linda didn't take my side completely. She thought 60 days was tight with school starting. But she stopped calling it an eviction and told Ethan he could not move into her 2-bedroom condo. My daughter, Rachel, drove down from Cleveland the following weekend. Ethan had asked her to talk sense into me. She arrived, guarded, and ready to mediate. I showed her the written notice and the contractor's card. I didn't ask her to choose between us. I told her she was welcome to speak to Ethan afterward. She sat in the den, looking at the files they expected me to box up. Did you ever promise him the house? She asked. No. Did you promise it to me? Despite everything. I laughed. No. She nodded. Good. At least you're consistent. Rachel did not become my champion. She told me the grandchildren would pay part of the price for our conflict. And she was right. But she also told Ethan that expecting an inheritance from a living parent was not a housing plan. For a few days after that, Ethan searched seriously. He and Melissa toured apartments and 2 duplexes. One older duplex was within their budget, close enough for Noah to remain at his school, and available in 3 weeks. The rooms were small, and the kitchen was dated. I thought they would take it. Ethan refused because the landlord would not replace the carpet before move-in. He told me they deserved something safe and decent. Safe and decent. Yes, I said. Perfect. No. He accused me of wanting them to fail so I could prove a point. I wanted to tell him I had spent 6 months preventing failure for him. Instead, I said the deadline remained. That choice cost them. By the time they reconsidered, the duplex had been rented. Another place required income verification. Melissa couldn't meet with part-time hours. A large complex approved them, but wanted a deposit they didn't have. Ethan asked me to co-sign. I said no. It was one of the hardest small words I have ever spoken. I offered to watch the children while they toured places. I gave him boxes from my shop. I would even help carry furniture. But I would not put my credit underneath another arrangement they could abandon while expecting me to absorb the consequences. At the end of the first month, Melissa found a modest 2-bedroom apartment through a coworker whose sister managed a small building. The children would share a room again. It was 12 minutes farther from school, and there was no yard. But the rent was manageable. Melissa wanted to reject it. Ethan surprised me by saying they should apply. Their arguments had changed by then. At first, they had argued about how unreasonable I was. Now they argued about the story Ethan had told in the first place. I heard Melissa say through their closed door, "I made plans because you told me he wanted this." Ethan replied too quietly for me to hear. She had still measured my bedroom. She had still called a contractor and spoken as if my deed were a formality. But I understood how people sometimes build confidence on top of the version of events they most want to believe. They signed the lease with 11 days left on my notice. Move-out day was hot and gray. Luis loaned me his brother's moving trailer, and I spent the morning carrying boxes from the upstairs rooms. Ethan remained angry, but the sharpness had drained out of him. Consequences had replaced the argument. As we loaded the children's bunk bed, he said, "You could have made this easier." I made the first 6 months easier. I mean for the kids. I put down my end of the bed rail. Don't make them responsible for a promise you invented. He stared at the driveway. For once, he didn't answer. Melissa came out carrying the box of paint samples. She dropped it into the trash bin. Then she walked back inside without looking at me. That was how I knew the fantasy was finally over. Not because they had lost an argument, but because they were leaving the plans behind. Before the trailer pulled away, Noah ran back and placed his green plastic dinosaur on the table beside my chair, "So I know where it is when I visit," he said. I hugged him and told him Sunday afternoons were always open. Ethan didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. I saw the children twice because Melissa brought them over. She was cool but civil. On the second visit, she stood in the kitchen while they played outside. "I shouldn't have talked about your house like it was ours," she said. It wasn't a complete apology. She added that Ethan had made the future sound settled, as though that explained everything. I told her his lie explained her assumption, but it didn't excuse what she did with it. She nodded once. "That's fair," she said. 2 months after the move, Ethan called and asked whether I wanted breakfast. At the diner, he spent 10 minutes discussing work and the children before finally looking at me. "I kept thinking you'd say yes if we got far enough," he admitted. Then I told Melissa it was basically decided. After that, backing up made me look like a liar. "You were a liar," he winced. "I know." He didn't ask to move back. He didn't ask for money. He said the apartment was crowded, but they had started tracking expenses and were saving again. Melissa had added another day at the dental office. They hoped to rent a duplex the next year. I told him I wanted a relationship with him, but help would no longer be based on vague promises. Visits had a beginning and an end. Loans would be written down. My house would remain mine for as long as I chose to own it. He said he understood. I wasn't sure he did yet. But understanding sometimes begins with respecting a boundary before you agree with it. We rebuilt slowly. Sunday visits resumed. Ethan started calling before coming over instead of using the spare key, which I had asked him to return when he moved. Some afternoons were stiff. Others felt almost normal. By winter, Noah and Sophie still shared a room, and the world had not ended. Ethan and Melissa had paid off one credit card. They were not grateful for the 60-day notice, and I did not expect them to be. But they were living inside a budget they controlled instead of a house they had quietly claimed. I kept my upstairs bedroom. I also kept the downstairs den, though I repainted it myself. Not blue, lavender, or warm gray. I chose a deep green that looked good beside the oak desk. I added shelves for my work files and left one low shelf empty except for Noah's plastic dinosaur. On quiet Sunday mornings, sunlight comes through the front window and lands across that little green toy. The house no longer feels crowded or contested. It feels like the place I rebuilt, and like a home my grandchildren can visit without being taught that love means taking possession. I lost the easy version of my relationship with my son, the one where I said yes and he called that closeness. What replaced it was less comfortable but more honest. If your adult child tried to assign you a smaller place in the home you owned, would you have given them more time or drawn the same line I did?